Dundurn Castle is today. 1813 up to this point had not gone well for the British. They had been defeated at the Battle of York, and their capital had been sacked and burned, much of it. They had also suffered many raids across Lake Ontario. Their fights on the frontier at Fort Meigs and places like that had not been going well, and supplies were looking desperate for them. The American forces gathering at Fort Niagara across the river from Fort George in present-day Niagara-on-the-Lake, they had assembled a massive force. Naval forces and infantry, artillery. The total number of forces that they had arranged was close to 6,000 men. And they launched their attack in the early hours of May 27th, where they successfully overwhelmed the British and Canadian defenders on the beach and pushed them out. The British commander, Brigadier General Vincent, felt that he did not have the forces to resist them. He had less than 1,500 men, so a wise choice in my opinion. So he made the decision to withdraw from the Niagara region back to Burlington Heights and potentially further. Now the troops you see coming onto the field, we have a mixture of troops. Right out the front, if you have any good loyal Canadians, if you want to give a cheer, we have some Canadian troops. We have soldiers from the 2nd York Militia. Now, militia duty was similar in the United States and Canada. If you were an able-bodied adult male, welcome to the militia. It was part of citizenship. In peacetime, the militia was more of a social club. You gather once a year, usually on a holiday like the King's birthday or the 4th of July, and you would prove that you could operate the musket, do a little bit of marching around, and then they would give you free beer. It was also a festival, so you would have music, you would have fireworks at night, so it became more of a carnival atmosphere than it did a military training day, and that kind of showed. At the beginning of the war, many of the militia were rather unreliable and not too militarily sound, but as the war progressed, militia got their act together. In the United States, they formed what were called volunteer regiments, in which they would be treated like regular soldiers. And in Canada, they began to form what we call flank companies, and eventually the Incorporated Militia of Upper Canada. These men were issued proper uniforms. So the uniforms you see, the green, blue trousers, those were makeshift uniforms due to a shortage of red cloth, and they wore those throughout 1813 into 1814. For much of the militia, because it's the entire adult male population, they wore civilian attire out on the field, which can be problematic because, well, today you can't tell who's a Canadian and who's an American just by first glance. Same thing 200 years ago. So they were trying to find ways to identify themselves. So, for example, at the Battle of Chippewa, the United States militia removed their hats before going into battle. You know, just something small, so hopefully only one guy shoots at you. You can also see the artillery pulling out. One of the great coups that the British had withdrawing from the Niagara is that they didn't lose any of their field artillery. They were able to get all of their cannons out and up, which is no small feat, because our road systems have improved considerably from what it was 200 years ago. The roads then were quite muddy, quite rutty, and it was quite easy to get stuck in. For those of you from Toronto, you know quite well what I'm talking about. And we also see musicians moving across the field. The corps of fife and drums. Fifes and drums were an excellent way to communicate across the battlefield. The high-pitched sound of the fife cuts over the sound of gunfire, and drums is a traditional weapon of war, so to say, to help mark cadence and to keep things moving along. They also were quite good at entertaining. Officers often used them to entertain themselves or some of the locals, and they had quite a variety of musical abilities. Now, we're all familiar with the volley fire of musketry. We see the troops out there beginning to engage, the British firing in volleys, but much more spaced out. This is known as light infantry style fighting. Light infantry was for scouting, skirmishing, bushfighting, and the idea was that by spreading out your forces, you presented a wider target and much more spaces for you, it's harder to hit you. But more importantly, you're not meant to actually do serious damage. You're meant to slow down an enemy. Light troops would be used kind of like tripwires. So if the enemy got too close, you could have your scouts and skirmishers start pecking at them, and it lets the general army know where the enemy is coming from. Light troops were often issued bugles for communication, and in clear weather, a bugle can be heard up to 3 miles away. Buglers would be able to tell another musician how many were approaching, what types of troop, everything, just with the use of the bugle. And you can hear the war cries on the edge from the Indigenous allies, which were probably one of the British, their best advantage as they withdrew, because as the Americans attempted to pursue, there were many instances where small bands of mostly Iroquois would launch these attacks against the American forces. One attack in particular, cavalrymen of the U.S. military were advancing along, and a force of about 12 Iroquois men attacked them, and they just fired a volley and charged out them rapidly. And such audacity led them to believe that there was a significantly greater number. We have to remember that during the time of the War of 1812, many of the American soldiers did not have much experience dealing with Indigenous people. Their knowledge of Indigenous people came from newspapers, and the newspapers of the time period were not known for being 100% honest, and they often portrayed Indigenous groups as these monsters and demons living out in the woods, which we know is absolute nonsense. But if you're a young 21-year-old from Massachusetts, you've never seen an Indigenous person before, and you hear those cries, well, it doesn't matter how much your rational mind's working, suddenly all those fears pop up, and the boogeyman's real. The fear was more powerful than anything at assisting the British at stopping and slowing the American pursuit.
I need to sit down. That's it. I can't hear you. Want to sit?
Now, as the Americans enter the battlefield, the American army that fought in 1812 needed a bit of work. The army of 1812 was a very poorly led and poorly trained organization, but the army of 1813 had seen a lot of the incompetent officers getting weeded out, and you were starting to see young, aggressive officers coming up through the ranks. Men like Scott. Oh, I'm sorry. Some people like when I warn you about the artillery. I've been doing this long enough. I don't even notice it anymore. But the American Army of 1813 was a much better army, particularly than the one that's fought at places like Queenston Heights. So during the Battle of Fort George, they fought hard and soundly beat the British and forced them off the field. As they pursued, though, the military experience and the ability of the individual soldier was oftentimes severely dampened by senior generals who were confused and nervous. Officers would stop and demand massive reinforcements when they would hear about even a small skirmish. They would send troops out and then pull them back, and then marching and counter-marching back and forth. And their ability of the individual soldier was much wasted during 1813. It was their handling during the withdrawal that gave some officers in the British military the belief that they could perhaps strike a counterstroke against the American forces. Oh, and I mentioned earlier, any good Canadians in the crowd? Give another cheer. Good. There's another 100% Canadian regiment on the field. Feel free to give them a cheer. Yeah, you'll see them over there fighting for the Americans. The Canadian Volunteers was a unit raised out of mostly the Niagara in 1813. However, there were some local them up here, including a fellow by the name of Markle, who would have been your member of the legislature if you were from Ancaster. So if you're from Ancaster, you got to check who you're voting for back then. But they joined up, about 150 of them by the end of the war, and they fought alongside the Americans. And they had a lot to lose. At the Ancaster Assizes in 1813, 1814, many of their officers were tried in absentia and sentenced to death if captured. So they knew full well that if they did not succeed, they were going to lose it all. And you can identify them by the green bands and white cockades worn on their hats. We mentioned about communication. You can hear a whistle coming from some of the light troops. Whistles were a very good way to communicate because, again, those high registers, they cut over the sound of battle and make it easier to hear. And there we go, one of those excellent volleys. Now, many people ask, why did they fight that way? And those long lines of firing in volleys, it seems almost silly, like you're taking turns. That's not the case. It's because of the weapons. Most of the troops on the battlefield are carrying flintlock, smoothbore muskets. That's what an average soldier would have carried 200 years ago. They are good weapons for the time, but they have their downsides. For example, some of the times when you see these folks pull the trigger, nothing happens. That's because you're relying on a piece of flint exposed to the elements, so you get a piece of steel, also exposed to the elements, that's supposed to make sparks that go in the side pan, also exposed to the elements, to ignite the charge. There's a lot of steps involved to get a flintlock to go. As a result, there's a lot of ways that it can go wrong. You can get fouling from the musket getting dirty from constant use. You can get rain, wind, snow. In good conditions, musket misfire rates were about 20%. So you can imagine in a wind or rainstorm, it's a stick. Now the other problem is being smoothbore, it's not terribly accurate. Now a really good shot at 100 yards could maybe hit a guy, but it's a big maybe. They've done testing, they found the rate of variance at 100 yards, about 9 feet in any direction. So if you're fighting about 200 yards, you've got 18 feet where it can go anywhere. How do you get something that doesn't like to work 20% of the time, to barely hit the broadside of a barn to work? Numbers. You get a big long line, you point the same direction, pull the trigger at the same time, the odds are somebody hit something. But fighting this way produces one more problem, and you're seeing a taste of it from the engagement out here: smoke. Black powder produces 20 times its own volume of smoke. So you can imagine a field with hundreds or thousands of soldiers, how quickly the smoke would cover the field. The infamous fog of war. At Lundy's Lane, they're about as far away as me, to these folks here, and could not see one another. Now this produces a problem because if someone steps out of the smoke, how do you know who to shoot? Well, it's simple. Red, blue. Every army in the world wore a distinctive uniform so that they could be better identified out on the battlefield. For the British, when they picked their uniform back in the 1600s, they went with red because it was the cheapest dye around. That's the same reason why we have red bottoms. The Americans, they went with blue because that was the color of uniform and cloth that was sent to them by the French during the American Revolution. So when it's red versus blue, nice and simple. Well, you notice we've got those Canadians in green. We've got the other Canadians wearing gray. What happens to those guys? Well, they get shot at by everybody. Friendly fire was a massive problem on the battlefield. And we have dozens and dozens of accounts of the War of 1812 of soldiers getting fired at by their own troops. In fact, at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, in all that thick smoke, one Canadian regiment lost more men to the British than they did to the Americans, simply because on that much smoke, you shoot first, ask questions later, and you'll survive. Now, the British were giving us a small example of what was known as a rolling volley in this time period. Rather than have the entire line of men all fire at once, they're broken up into smaller groups, and they fire one after the other down the line. The idea of that is, if you had 1,000 men in groups of 100, by the time Group 10 had fired, Group 1 was already reloaded and was firing again, giving a constant rate of fire across the battlefield. So, as it was said, there was a machine gun in 1812, it just took 1,000 men to do it. You'll notice as well the officers on both sides leading from out the front and moving about. They're easily spotted by their much nicer uniforms, the nice headgear and everything like that. And officers have nicer uniforms, the same reason anybody lives better than anybody else. They pay. Officers in both armies were expected to purchase their own uniforms, weapons, and equipment, and as a result, they spent a fair amount of money to get into their position. Begs the question, why spend all that money to get shot at? Well, officers in the British Army could win land, title, promotion, and become very famous in their own right. Excellent example is a young man who at 14 had two hobbies, getting drunk and playing the fiddle. He attempted to marry a girl and she refused him because he was a drunkard who played the fiddle. So at 17 he went off into the army, and by the end of his military career he was no longer a fiddler and a drunkard. He was a lord, a duke, a viscount, a field marshal, knighted by the king, 5 mansions and estate, and a wealth that today would exceed 40 billion pounds. Nobody knew him as the drunkard, they knew him as Wellington by that point. For the Americans it was similar, but instead of getting land and title, you often would get political power. You would end up becoming, afterwards, running for governor or running for president. Look at all the presidents that came out of the war. You've got William Henry Harrison, you've got Zachary Taylor, you've got Andrew Jackson, and Sam Houston. He was president of Texas, so it counts. I had a question about in the British forces, you see some guys with pikes. Those are sergeants. Sergeants in the British Army in this time period of the battalion and of the grenadier companies would carry pikes onto the battlefield. And it was a position of their authority and also a marker on the field so you can see where your sergeant was. They would be trained to use them in hand-to-hand combat, but that was a last resort. The pike was used mostly just for a mark of their position, a mark of their authority, and if worse comes to worse, you could bring it down and use it to help lead your men out into the field. If you look down at the end of the American line, you can see some troops that are kind of in a mishmash. That's what I was talking about when we talked about militia. Militia, oftentimes, if they could get a uniform, it's usually very basic, but for a lot of them raised up from the countryside, they had to come with whatever they were wearing. Some states would actually have stocks of cloth purchased so that when you were going to be called up, you could